The courtroom cameras captured the exact moment when everything changed. Brandon Matthews, a 32-year-old tech entrepreneur who had built his entire identity around being smarter than everyone else in the room, sat in the defendant's chair with a smirk that screamed entitlement. His designer suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His perfectly styled hair gleamed under the courtroom lights, and his expensive leather briefcase sat beside him like a trophy of his superiority. He had no idea that Judge Judy would orchestrate the most devastating public humiliation ever captured on television. What started as his confident dismissal of America's toughest judge would end with him being escorted from the courtroom in tears, his reputation destroyed, his arrogance shattered, and his face becoming the internet's newest symbol of karma, delivered with surgical precision. Brandon Matthews wasn't just any defendant walking into Judge Judy's courtroom that Tuesday morning. He was a self-made millionaire who had sold his first tech startup at age 28, a man who regularly posted LinkedIn articles about success, mindset, and winning strategies, someone who truly believed that confidence and aggression were the keys to conquering any situation. His social media was filled with motivational quotes about dominating negotiations and never backing down. He had walked into that courthouse telling his lawyer that daytime TV judges were just entertainers playing dress-up. That real legal strategy would expose Judge Judy as the fraud he believed she was. He actually thought this court appearance would be great publicity for his personal brand. He planned to clip the footage for his YouTube channel, where he taught people how to win arguments and crush their competition. The case seemed simple enough in his mind. A former business partner, Michael Chen, was suing him for $5,000 over what Brandon called a simple misunderstanding about profit sharing. Brandon saw this as nothing more than a poor loser who couldn't handle being outmaneuvered by someone smarter and more successful. Michael Chen sat in the plaintiff's chair, looking exhausted and defeated. For 18 months, he had tried every legal avenue to recover the money Brandon owed him. They had started their software company together as equal partners, working 16-hour days in Michael's garage, living on ramen noodles and dreams. When their app finally gained traction and a buyer emerged offering $200,000, Brandon had convinced Michael to let him handle the negotiations, since he had more business experience. Michael trusted his friend and partner. He signed the papers Brandon put in front of him, believing they were splitting everything 50-50 as originally agreed. But 3 weeks after the sale closed, Michael discovered the devastating truth. Brandon had restructured the company documents right before the sale, reducing Michael's stake from 50% to just 5%. Instead of receiving $100,000, Michael got a check for $10,000, while Brandon pocketed $190,000. When Michael confronted him, Brandon just laughed and told him that business wasn't personal, that the weak get eaten in the real world, and that he should have read the fine print. Michael had spent his last savings trying to hire lawyers, but Brandon's legal team had buried him in paperwork and delays. This appearance on Judge Judy was Michael's final chance at any kind of justice. The audience that day had no idea they were about to witness something that would break the internet. The regular Judge Judy viewers, mostly retirees who had been watching the show for decades, settled into their seats expecting another entertaining case. The production crew ran through their standard checks. The bailiff took his position. The court stenographer prepared her equipment. Judge Judy reviewed the case file one final time, and something in her expression suggested she knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary episode. She had read both sides' submissions the night before. She had noticed the discrepancies in Brandon's paperwork. She had seen the timeline that didn't quite add up. Most importantly, she had recognized a pattern she had seen thousands of times in her 35 years on the bench. Brandon Matthews was exactly the type of arrogant predator who believed intelligence meant the right to exploit others, who confused manipulation with business acumen, who thought respect was something only weak people needed to show. Judge Judy had been destroying people like Brandon since before he was born, and she was about to teach him a lesson that would echo through every business school and courtroom in America. Before we show you the exact moment when Judge Judy's revenge destroyed Brandon Matthews forever, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith that arrogance always meets its match. This isn't just another courtroom case. This is a masterclass in why you should never underestimate someone based on their platform, why disrespect always comes with consequences, and why Judge Judy has remained America's most feared legal mind for over 25 years. Drop. A comment right now telling me if you've ever had to deal with someone like Brandon Matthews and someone who thought being smart meant they could treat people like disposable tools. Trust me, what you're about to witness will be the most satisfying 8 minutes of courtroom justice you've ever seen. Brandon Matthews entered Judge Judy's courtroom like he was walking onto a stage he owned. His confident stride, the way he casually tossed his briefcase onto the defendant's table, the dismissive glance he gave Michael Chen, everything about his body language screamed that he believed this was his show now. He had spent the morning in the courthouse bathroom practicing his arguments in the mirror, perfecting his authoritative tone, rehearsing the exact facial expressions he would use to project dominance. He pulled out his phone one last time before the bailiff collected it, firing off a quick Instagram story with the caption, "About to school a TV judge on real business law. Stay tuned for clips." His 47,000 followers had no idea they were about to watch their guru become the internet's biggest joke. Brandon settled into his chair with the posture of someone who had never lost an argument in his life, crossing his legs casually and arranging his expression into what he thought was intimidating confidence. Judge Judy watched this entire performance with the patience of a lion watching a gazelle that didn't know it was already dead. The case began with Judge Judy's standard opening, her voice cutting through the courtroom with that signature no-nonsense authority that had made her a cultural icon. "Mr. Matthews, you're being sued for $5,000 by your former business partner Michael Chen, who claims you defrauded him out of his rightful share of your company sale. Mr. Chen, tell me what happened." Michael's voice shook as he began explaining how they had started the company together, how Brandon had promised equal partnership, how everything changed when the buyer appeared. He pulled out the original partnership agreement they had both signed, showing the 50-50 split clearly documented. His hands trembled as he described discovering the restructured documents that had stolen his share. Judge Judy listened carefully, asking pointed questions about timelines and documentation. Michael provided text messages, emails, the original contract, everything he had managed to preserve. Throughout this testimony, Brandon sat with an expression that radiated barely contained amusement, occasionally shaking his head and rolling his eyes as if Michael was describing something completely fictional. When Judge Judy turned her attention to Brandon, asking him to explain his version of events, the first cracks in professional courtroom decorum began to appear. Brandon didn't just answer questions. He launched into what he clearly believed was a brilliant defense. Speaking to Judge Judy like she was a student who needed basic concepts, explained slowly, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I think you need to understand how business partnerships actually work in the real world." The words hung in the air for a moment, and experienced Judge Judy viewers felt their spines tingle with anticipation. They knew that phrase, "with all due respect," was usually followed by something monumentally disrespectful. Brandon continued, oblivious to the danger he was walking into. Michael here signed documents that clearly stated the terms. If he didn't bother to read what he was signing, that's not fraud. That's just bad business on his part. In the tech world, we call that a learning experience. He actually smiled at the camera when he said this, as if sharing wisdom with the viewing audience. Judge Judy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. The audience members glanced at each other with raised eyebrows. The bailiff, who had stood through thousands of cases, straightened slightly. Even the stenographer paused momentarily in her typing. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair and asked a deceptively simple question. "Mr. Matthews, when exactly did you change the partnership structure?" Brandon's answer came without hesitation or shame. "About 2 weeks before the sale closed. The buyer wanted a cleaner cap table, and I made the executive decision to restructure. That's what leaders do, Your Honor. They make tough calls." Judge Judy nodded slowly, making a note. "And did you inform Mr. Chen about these changes before he signed the new documents?" Brandon's response revealed the depth of his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of who he was dealing with. "I sent him the documents. If he didn't read them carefully, that's on him. I'm not his babysitter. This is business, not kindergarten." The disrespect was escalating with each answer, and Brandon seemed to be feeding off what he perceived as his own brilliance. Judge Judy asked about the original agreement, and Brandon waved it off dismissively. "That was just a preliminary document. Things change in business. Flexible people succeed. Rigid people like Michael get left behind. When Judge Judy pressed him on whether he had verbally discussed the changes with Michael before having him sign, Brandon actually laughed, not a small chuckle, but a genuine laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Your Honor, I don't have time to hold everyone's hand through basic paperwork." Michael's an adult. He signed documents. That's how contracts work. The audience audibly gasped at this response, but Brandon interpreted their reaction as support for his business acumen rather than horror at his callousness. He was so convinced of his own superiority that he couldn't read the room he was destroying himself in. What Brandon Matthews didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have understood in his arrogance-fueled blindness, was that Judge Judy had been practicing law since before he was born. She had presided over family court in Manhattan for 25 years, handling thousands of cases involving fraud, manipulation, and exploitation. She had seen every type of scammer, every variety of con artist, every breed of person who thought intelligence gave them the right to prey on others. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot patterns of predatory behavior. Within the first 30 seconds of meeting someone, Brandon had triggered every single warning sign the moment he strutted through her courtroom door. While he was performing for cameras and congratulating himself on his clever answers, Judge Judy had been methodically building a trap that would snap shut with devastating precision. She had been asking specific questions designed to get Brandon to commit to particular statements on record. She had been giving him rope, letting his arrogance convince him to brag about actions that were not clever business moves, but actual crimes. And Brandon, blinded by his belief in his own brilliance, had walked straight into every trap she set. The turning point came when Judge Judy asked Brandon to explain the exact timeline of events leading up to the document signing. Brandon, still riding high on his perceived dominance of the courtroom, pulled out his own carefully prepared timeline printed on expensive paper with his company logo at the top. He walked Judge Judy through each step with the condescending tone of a professor lecturing a particularly slow student. On March 15th, the buyer expressed interest. On March 22nd, I restructured the company for optimal sale value. On April 3rd, I presented Michael with the updated documents. On April 5th, he signed them. On April 12th, the sale closed. It's all very straightforward business procedure, Your Honor. What Brandon didn't realize was that each date he confidently recited was another nail in his coffin. Judge Judy made careful notes, occasionally nodding as if impressed by his organizational skills when in reality, she was documenting his confession to multiple counts of fraud, with timestamps he was providing himself. Judge Judy then shifted to questions about communication between Brandon and Michael during this period. Brandon explained with obvious pride how he had carefully worded his emails to Michael, how he had used business terminology that technically disclosed the changes, while ensuring Michael wouldn't actually understand what was happening until it was too late. He actually bragged about this strategy, describing it as smart negotiation tactics. I told Michael we were optimizing the corporate structure for maximum value. That's accurate language. If he interpreted that to mean something different, that's not my responsibility. In business, you have to be precise with language and you have to be smart enough to understand what you're signing. The courtroom had gone completely silent, except for Brandon's voice. Even he seemed to notice the strange atmosphere, but his arrogance interpreted it as people being impressed by his business acumen, rather than horrified by his casual admission of fraud. Judge Judy asked if he had any written communications from Michael questioning the changes, and Brandon proudly pulled out his phone records showing he had ignored multiple calls and texts from Michael in the days before the signing. Then came the moment that would seal Brandon's fate forever. Judge Judy asked a seemingly innocent question about his business philosophy. "Mr. Matthews, you've mentioned several times that this is just how business works. Tell me, in your view, what separates legal business strategy from fraud?" Brandon's eyes lit up like he had been waiting for this exact question. He sat forward in his chair, gesturing expansively as he launched into what he clearly believed was a brilliant philosophical explanation. "Your Honor, fraud is when you lie about facts. What I did was present information in a way that advantaged my position. That's not lying. That's strategic communication. Michael had access to all the same information I did. He just wasn't smart enough to understand it. In the business world, we reward intelligence and punish laziness. If someone can't be bothered to carefully read documents before signing them, they deserve what they get. That's not fraud. That's natural selection in capitalism. The words came out of his mouth with such confidence, such absolute certainty in his own righteousness that even Judge Judy's legendary poker face showed a flicker of something. Not anger exactly, but the kind of cold satisfaction a chess master feels when their opponent makes the exact move they've been waiting for. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair and smiled slightly. The kind of smile that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to be absolutely destroyed. That's very interesting. Mr. Matthews, your philosophy on business ethics is quite illuminating. Brandon actually beamed, believing he had just impressed her with his worldview. Before we continue with this case, I'd like to clarify a few things about your business history. You've presented yourself as a successful entrepreneur, someone who understands how legitimate business operates. Let me ask you about some of your other ventures. The confidence in Brandon's expression flickered for just a moment, a tiny crack in his armor, but he recovered quickly and nodded. Of course, Your Honor. I'm happy to discuss my track record of success. Judge Judy opened a thick folder that had been sitting on her desk throughout the entire proceeding. Brandon's eyes followed the folder with the first hint of genuine concern. He hadn't expected Judge Judy to have researched beyond the basic case documents. What happened next would become the most replayed moment in courtroom television history. Judge Judy began reading from the folder with the methodical precision of a prosecutor who already knows the verdict. Mr. Matthews, or should I say Brandon James Matthews, formerly operating under the business name Quantum Solutions LLC, in 2019, you were sued by 3 former business partners for nearly identical behavior to what Mr. Chin describes. You settled that case out of court for an undisclosed sum with the condition that the details remain confidential. Brandon's face went from confident to confused to concerned in the span of 3 seconds. That was a completely different situation, he stammered, but Judge Judy held up her hand for silence. In 2020, you dissolved another partnership under suspicious circumstances, leaving your co-founder with nothing despite that person having invested $50,000 in startup capital. That case was also settled privately. In 2021, you were investigated by the State Business Licensing Board for misrepresenting your credentials to potential investors, a complaint that was dropped only because your victims chose not to pursue charges. With each revelation, Brandon's carefully constructed facade crumbled a little more. The color began draining from his face, progressing from healthy tan to pale to something approaching gray. Judge Judy wasn't finished. She continued reading with devastating calm, each sentence landing like a physical blow. You've used 4 different business names across 5 years, each time partnering with someone who had technical skills you lacked, and each time managing to emerge from dissolved partnerships with the majority of assets while your partners got nothing. The pattern is so consistent, Mr. Matthews, that it stops looking like coincidental business disagreements and starts looking like systematic fraud. Brandon tried to interrupt, his voice rising with panic. Those are all completely taken out of context. You can't just bring up settled cases that have nothing to do with this situation. Judge Judy's response was ice cold. Actually, Mr. Matthews, I can. It's called establishing a pattern of behavior, and in my courtroom, when someone shows me who they are repeatedly, I believe them. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of shock and approval. Michael Chen, who had been sitting quietly throughout Brandon's confident performance, looked up with tears in his eyes, finally seeing someone in authority taking his claim seriously. But Judge Judy had saved her most devastating revelation for last. She pulled out another document from the folder, this one with official state seals visible even from a distance. Mr. Matthews, are you aware that Mr. Chin filed a formal complaint with the State Business Fraud Division 3 months ago? Brandon's mouth fell open. He clearly had no idea this had happened. The investigator assigned to that complaint reached out to your previous business partners, the ones from those settled cases you thought were buried and forgotten. And wouldn't you know it, when people are granted immunity from those confidentiality agreements in exchange for testimony in a fraud investigation, they become remarkably willing to talk about their experiences with you. Judge Judy let this information sink in for a moment, watching Brandon's face cycle through expressions of shock, horror, and dawning realization. So, Mr. Matthews, when you walked into my courtroom today, planning to use your clever language and business philosophy to justify stealing from your partner, you had no idea that you weren't just defending a civil case. You are confessing to a pattern of fraud that is currently under active criminal investigation. The transformation in Brandon Matthews was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The man who had strutted into the courtroom like he owned it, who had spent the last 20 minutes condescending to a former New York family court judge with 25 years of experience, suddenly looked like a teenager who just realized his parents found his report card. His expensive suit that had looked so sharp and powerful moments ago now seemed like a costume, like he was a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. His perfectly styled hair that he had spent 30 minutes arranging that morning now looked ridiculous, like he had been preparing for a photo shoot while walking into an ambush. The leather briefcase with his company logo, the designer watch, the confident posture, all of it collapsed in real time as the full weight of what Judge Judy had just revealed crashed down on him like a building imploding. His hands, which had been gesturing so confidently while he explained his business philosophy, now trembled visibly as they gripped the edge of the defendant's table. His breathing became audibly rapid, picked up by the sensitive courtroom microphones that captured every detail of his unraveling. Brandon's voice, when he finally managed to speak, had completely changed from the authoritative tone he had been using. "Your Honor, that investigation? I wasn't informed." The words came out disjointed and panicked. Nothing like the smooth business speak he had been deploying so effectively just moments before Judge Judy cut him off with surgical precision. "You weren't informed because investigations don't typically notify their subjects until charges are filed. But you've just spent the last 20 minutes on national television explaining in detail how you systematically defraud your business partners, using your own words to describe actions that constitute multiple felonies under state business law. You've provided dates, methods, and even your philosophical justification for behavior that prosecutors would normally have to work months to prove." The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the sound of Brandon's increasingly desperate breathing. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. The complete and total destruction of someone's arrogance, captured in real time for millions of viewers to witness. Michael Chen sat frozen in his chair, tears streaming down his face as he watched the man who had stolen his dreams and mocked his pain finally face consequences. For 18 months, Michael had been told by lawyers that Brandon was too smart, too well-connected, too protected by legal loopholes to ever face real accountability. He had watched Brandon post on social media about his lavish lifestyle, spending money that should have been Michael's on exotic vacations and luxury cars. He had endured Brandon's friends commenting on his posts about how business requires ruthlessness and how weak people deserve to lose. He had suffered through depositions where Brandon's expensive attorneys had made him feel stupid for trusting someone he thought was his friend. And now in this moment he was watching Judge Judy accomplish, in 20 minutes, what an army of lawyers couldn't do in a year and a half. She had let Brandon's own arrogance become the weapon that destroyed him, had given him enough rope and watched him weave it into a noose with his own hands. Judge Judy continued with relentless precision, each word calculated to maximize its impact. "Mr. Matthews, let me explain something to you about the difference between business strategy and criminal fraud, since you seem confused. When you deliberately obscure material information with the intent to deceive someone into signing documents that harm their interests while benefiting yours, that's fraud. When you establish a pattern of this behavior across multiple victims over multiple years, that's racketeering. When you brag about it on national television and describe it as your business philosophy, that's a prosecutor's dream case." Brandon tried again to speak, his voice cracking with desperation. "I want to invoke my right to remain silent. I don't have to answer any more questions." Judge Judy's laugh was sharp and utterly without humor. "Mr. Matthews, this is a civil court, not a criminal proceeding. You don't have a right to remain silent here. But I suspect the detectives who are undoubtedly going to be very interested in this footage will be happy to read you your Miranda rights very soon." The audience erupted in applause, but Judge Judy raised her hand for silence. She wasn't finished destroying Brandon Matthews yet. "Let's talk about your actual business acumen. Mr. Matthews, since you've spent so much time today lecturing me and Mr. Chin about how business really works, you've had 5 different business ventures in 5 years. That's not the track record of a brilliant entrepreneur. That's the track record of someone who cycles through victims. You claimed earlier that weak people get left behind in business, but looking at your actual history, It seems like the only business skill you've mastered is finding trusting people and betraying them. That's not capitalism. That's parasitism. Brandon had slumped forward in his chair, his head nearly touching the table. The confident posture was completely gone, replaced by the hunched stance of someone trying to make themselves as small as possible. His face had gone from gray to almost green, and viewers watching at home would later comment that they could pinpoint the exact moment his soul left his body. Judge Judy turned her attention to the actual case at hand, though everyone in the courtroom knew the judgment had already been decided the moment Brandon opened his mouth. "Mr. Chen, you came here asking for $5,000, the amount you could prove in damages under small claims guidelines. But based on what I've heard today, and based on Mr. Matthews' own testimony about how he deliberately structured this fraud, I'm ruling in your favor for the full amount, plus court costs." The gavel hadn't even come down yet when Judge Judy continued. "However, Mr. Chen, I strongly encourage you to contact the state prosecutor's office and provide them with copies of these court proceedings. I suspect they'll be very interested in Mr. Matthews' detailed explanation of his business practices." Michael nodded, unable to speak through his tears of relief. Judge Judy then delivered her final statement directly to Brandon, words that would be quoted in business schools and ethics classes for years to come. "Mr. Matthews, you walked into my courtroom today thinking you were smarter than everyone else. You thought your expensive suit and your business jargon would intimidate me. You thought your philosophy of exploitation was a sophisticated strategy. But here's what you failed to understand. Real intelligence isn't about manipulating people. Real business success isn't about finding victims. And real strength isn't about preying on trust. You're not a successful entrepreneur. You're a con artist who got lucky for a few years. And today, your luck ran out." The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Brandon Matthews sat motionless as the bailiff approached him. He made no move to stand, no attempt to gather his expensive briefcase or straighten his designer suit. He just sat there, a broken shell of the confident man who had entered the courtroom 30 minutes earlier. The cameras captured every detail of his complete psychological collapse. His hands were still trembling, his breathing still rapid and shallow, and his eyes, once bright with arrogant certainty, now stared into nothing with the hollow expression of someone who had just watched their entire world implode. As he was finally escorted from the courtroom, he moved like a zombie, feet shuffling, shoulders hunched, head down. The man who had planned to clip this footage for his YouTube channel about winning strategies was leaving as the star of a very different kind of viral video, one that would make him the internet's newest cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets accountability. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind Brandon Matthews, the atmosphere inside erupted with an energy the production staff later said they had never experienced in decades of filming. The audience members who had sat in stunned silence throughout the systematic destruction of Brandon's arrogance broke into sustained applause that lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Michael Chen collapsed into his chair, his entire body shaking with sobs of relief and vindication. The bailiff, who prided himself on maintaining professional composure regardless of case outcomes, was seen wiping his eyes. Even the court stenographer, who had transcribed thousands of cases with detached proficiency, looked visibly moved by what she had just witnessed. Judge Judy remained seated at her bench, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, understanding that what had just occurred transcended a simple small claims case. This had been a masterclass in how arrogance, when given enough rope, will inevitably hang itself. She had spent 30 minutes letting Brandon dig his own grave with his own words, and the audience had just watched karma deliver justice with devastating precision. Within 90 minutes of the episode airing, the internet exploded with a force that shocked even seasoned social media analysts. The clip of Brandon questioning Judge Judy's understanding of business, followed immediately by her revelation of his criminal investigation, became the most shared courtroom video in internet history. Twitter users created the Brandon Matthews challenge, sarcastically posting examples of people whose arrogance had backfired spectacularly. The video hit 10 million views within the first 4 hours. By the end of the first day, it had been shared over 50 million times across every platform imaginable. TikTok users made reaction videos, pausing at the exact moment Brandon's face changed from confident to horrified, with captions like "the moment he realized" and "instant Karma caught in 4K. Business school professors began using the clip in ethics classes as a perfect example of how fraud actually works versus how fraudsters justify their behavior. LinkedIn, ironically, Brandon's favorite platform for posting motivational content, became flooded with commentary about authentic business practices versus exploitation. The fallout in Brandon's real life was swift, merciless, and absolutely catastrophic. Within 24 hours of the episode airing, his company's website had been taken down and replaced with a message announcing the cessation of operations. His social media accounts, which had accumulated tens of thousands of followers through his motivational business content, were flooded with comments from former associates, clients, and business contacts. People he had worked with over the years began sharing their own stories of Brandon's questionable practices. A Reddit thread titled "I Worked with Brandon Matthews AMA" gained over 40,000 comments from people claiming to have been victimized by his business tactics. His professional network dissolved overnight as everyone who had ever associated with him rushed to publicly distance themselves from the toxic brand he had become. The tech industry, which had once viewed him as a rising star, now treated his name like poison. Industry publications ran articles analyzing how someone with such a clear pattern of fraudulent behavior had managed to operate for so long without being stopped. The criminal investigation that Judge Judy had revealed on national television accelerated dramatically after prosecutors watched Brandon's courtroom confession. The State Business Fraud Division, which had been methodically building its case through careful investigation and witness interviews, suddenly found itself with a gift prosecutors dream of but rarely receive. Brandon had confessed to his entire operational methodology on camera, with timestamps, specific examples, and even a philosophical justification that demonstrated clear intent to defraud. Within 2 weeks of the episode airing, formal criminal charges were filed. Brandon faced 17 counts of fraud, 6 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of filing false business documents. His previous business partners, freed from their confidentiality agreements by the criminal investigation, provided testimony that corroborated every pattern Judge Judy had identified. The prosecution's case was so strong, built largely on Brandon's own televised words, that his defense attorneys advised him that going to trial would be suicide. 6 months after his humiliation on Judge Judy, Brandon Matthews pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, plus restitution to all his victims totaling over $400,000. Michael Chen's life took a dramatically different trajectory. The $5,000 judgment from Judge Judy was just the beginning of his recovery. The publicity from the case brought him into contact with ethical investors who were impressed by his technical skills and moved by his story. Within 8 months, Michael had launched a new startup focused on creating transparent partnership agreements and blockchain-verified business contracts. His company's mission statement explicitly referenced his experience with Brandon, pledging to build technology that would prevent other entrepreneurs from being victimized by predatory partners. The business attracted significant investment from venture capitalists who saw both the market opportunity and the powerful origin story. Michael became a speaker at entrepreneurship conferences, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of protecting yourself in business partnerships while maintaining ethical standards. He established a foundation that provided legal assistance to small business owners who had been defrauded by their partners, directly helping dozens of people who found themselves in situations similar to what he had endured. The case became a cultural phenomenon that transcended typical viral courtroom moments. Legal experts wrote academic papers analyzing Judge Judy's interrogation technique and how she had constructed a trap that gave Brandon enough confidence to confess to crimes he didn't even realize he was admitting. Business ethics professors used the full episode as required viewing, asking students to identify the exact moments when legitimate business strategy crossed into fraud. Psychology researchers studied the footage to understand the cognitive dissonance that allows people like Brandon to genuinely believe their predatory behavior is justified. The episode was referenced in congressional hearings about white-collar crime, with legislators pointing to Brandon's case as evidence that fraud often hides behind sophisticated business language and that prosecutors need better tools to identify and stop systematic Predators Judge Judy herself, in a rare interview about a specific case, explained that Brandon Matthews represented a type of criminal she had encountered throughout her career. People who are genuinely intelligent, but use that intelligence exclusively for exploitation, who mistake manipulation for strategy and see other people only as resources to be extracted. For Brandon Matthews, his 30 minutes of trying to outwit Judge Judy resulted in losing everything he had spent years building through fraud and manipulation. His money was gone to restitution and legal fees. His reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. His freedom was taken by a prison sentence, and his face was forever immortalized as the internet's perfect example of arrogance meeting instant karma. He had walked into that courtroom planning to add footage to his personal brand as a winning strategist. Instead, he created the most devastating cell phone in television history, a permanent record of how quickly confidence without ethics can collapse into consequences. Judge Judy had given him exactly what he deserved, not through anger or emotion, but through the cold, methodical application of justice that had made her a legend. She had let him perform, let him boast, let him explain his philosophy of exploitation in his own words, and then she had simply revealed the truth that destroyed him. It was revenge delivered with surgical precision, karma administered with perfect timing, and justice served exactly as it should be. If this story of instant karma and courtroom justice restored your faith in accountability, smash that like button right now. Subscribe for more incredible moments where arrogance meets its end and karma delivers exactly what people deserve. Drop a comment telling me what you think Brandon Matthews deserved. And share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that disrespect and fraud always come with consequences. Because in Judge Judy's courtroom, and in life, arrogance never wins. It just takes longer for some people to learn that lesson than others. And Brandon Matthews learned it in the most public, most permanent, most devastating way possible.